Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Today, we're going to talk about how to enrich your data lake with AWS Transfer Family. I'm Matt Matthews, and I'm the General Manager for AWS Transfer Family, and I'm joined today by Russ Boyer, Senior Solution Architect, also with AWS Transfer Family. So today, we're going to cover a number of things. We're going to start in general talking about what is the value of data lakes, and specifically business-to-business or B2B data. We'll talk a little bit about what is the AWS Transfer Family, what is the service, and a little overview of the service and how it helps specifically with that B2B data. We'll talk about some common use cases. We'll go through some customer testimonials, and then Russ will take us through a technical deep dive as well as a demo. So let's get started with some real world data. So a recent report by IDC interviewed a number of AWS customers that were embarking on moving from these siloed data warehouses into data lakes. And what they found was an astonishing return on investment. So 415% 5-year ROI on that investment, 79% reduced time to run queries, 48% time reduced total cost of operations, 9-month payback period, and even more importantly, $6.15 million of average annual benefit per organization and additional new revenues of $4.1 million. These are tremendous business values and benefits from going from these siloed data warehouse architectures into data lakes. So we see this happening across many businesses. And the reason is, we know that data is coming from more and more sources, but it's also growing at a tremendous rate. It's reported that by 2025, the data generated across all sources will double to about 175 zettabytes. That's just an amazing amount of data. But we still see many organizations with siloed data warehouses. And so what happens is they're not able to take advantage of all the data that's available. Their BI business operations teams aren't able to get a holistic view of the data, which leads to reduced amounts of insights that they can garner from the data that's available. And all that leads to an impact into how actionable or how they can take action from the insights in the data. So what we see is in this transition to data lakes, this push to get better insights and analytics allows customers to get more data, first of all. So for customer data, for example, daily transactions, queries from customers, economic data, or other data sources can all be put together into a common data lake, which allows the BI and the business operations teams to give better analytics, so better sales forecasts, better understanding of expenses, better understanding of risks that the business is facing. And then all of that, again, leads to really meaningful impacts. So as we know, it's a really dynamic time in the world, and organizations need to be able to react faster. They need to be able to optimize their supply chains, and they need to be able to take their data and their insights and reach subscribers and make sure they can reach the right people with those insights. So that's all really great, and we see a lot of these benefits coming from these data lake architectures. But what about B2B data and B2B sources of data? What are B2B sources? So B2B sources come from your vendors and your partners and your suppliers. So these are things like purchase orders or shipment notifications or inventory status updates that are coming from not only your supply chain, your manufacturing partners, also from your retail and distribution partners as well. And much of this data is integrated into internal systems like CRMs or ERPs and whatnot, and eventually finds its way into a data warehouse or even a data lake, at which point it could get analyzed and show up on a dashboard at some point. But the interesting thing about B2B data is that it's really valuable at the time that it's generated. So it is very real-time sensitive data. And really what we want to do is enable businesses to be able to not only leverage this data as they need to transact their businesses with their partners, but also leverage the insights more directly at the time that it's generated. And we see this B2B data everywhere across all industries, from financial institutions, things like consolidated audit logs, statements, settlement data, etc. We see this in healthcare and life sciences, clinical trial data for pharmaceutical companies, or patient health records from care providers. We see it in media and entertainment, so multimedia data, obviously, but also subscription data or proprietary content that's being monetized. And then more broadly across the manufacturing supply chains. And this is things like shipper carrier data, information about suppliers, and supplier data, et cetera. And so it's all this B2B data is everywhere across these industries. And what we see is that it's not only challenging to get this data, but it comes with many additional challenges because it is external data. So anything from regulatory compliance issues, confidentiality, entitlement control, and this, as I said, this data is highly real time, and it often comes in very specialized data formats. So let's talk a little bit about how AWS Transfer Family can help with this. So AWS Transfer Family is a fully managed solution to help with file transfers, especially external file transfers. And it's really important to help modernize business to business file transfers, help get that data, integrate that data into your environment, and especially into your data lakes. We focus a lot on this notion of seamless migration. So many customers or many companies have existing infrastructure that they use to get data from partners, and they don't want to have to tell their partners that anything changes. They want to seamlessly migrate to the cloud and have that be completely transparent for their partners. We also focus on being a fully managed service. So we're owning and operating the file transfer infrastructure and the capabilities on customers' behalf, so they can focus on their core business. And as many AWS services, we are extremely highly available. We operate in multiple AZs, and we're available globally in all the regions that AWS operates in. Many of our customers are in regulated industries, and they deal with many compliance requirements. So we have a large number of security and compliance capabilities, from HIPAA and SOX, and many, many more. Being an AWS service, we're also natively integrated with many other AWS services. So this helps our customers build true end-to-end solutions, leveraging things like S3 and EFS cloud storage, AWS Lambda for serverless compute infrastructure, or even CloudWatch for metrics and monitoring. The service is extremely cost-effective. It's priced in a pay-as-you-go model, and it's really easy to use. So let's talk about some of the common use cases we see for these file transfers. And I'm going to talk about this in the sense of a life cycle and what we see across our customers. We usually start with the notion of file connectivity. So how do I get these sources of data in? What are the protocols that I need to allow me to connect to external sources of data easily? And then what do I do with the data? How do I make it ready to ingest into a data lake or do any other kinds of processing that I need to make the data actionable? And then how do I control access to that data? I've got external parties that have now access to my cloud storage. I need to make sure I can control what they can send to me or what they can take from me. And then I may again want to take the insights that I've learned from my data analysis through my data lake and redistribute them as content. And I want to be able to do that in a way where I'm controlling the entitlements for my subscribers. So these are all the things that we see customers doing in essentially a life cycle of capabilities. So let's look at some of the use cases that are supported by these capabilities. So when we talk about file connectivity, we have many sources of data that are internal from business systems like ERPs and CRMs. As the sources of these data are external, the challenge becomes a little different. And many times we need to get that data in the form of a file for it to be transferred into our environment because it's coming from somebody else and we can't access their systems directly. So we need to use these common protocols, including SFTP or FTP. These are protocols that have been around for a long time. They're highly trusted and highly secure. And there's many times mechanisms that have existed in companies to use these protocols to exchange information with external parties. So we start with that, and that allows us to easily get this data from business applications such as ERPs and CRMs, human resources systems, whatever it is, from our partners into the data lake. And then again, we want to automate the processing of these files for data lake ingest. So AWS Transfer has a number of low-code capabilities that allows us to help customers process the data. And easily automate that processing. You may want to copy or tag the information so you can have easier organization of it. You may want to do some kind of custom processing of it using our serverless compute capabilities called Lambda. Maybe that's processing the data, enriching it in some way, transforming it in some way, or just scanning it for malware before it's entered into the data lake. And then again, you want to be able to easily access control to files and folders. AWS Transfer Family integrates natively with our identity and access management capabilities, or IAM. And this allows customers to have very fine-grained access controls. Who gets to see what folders, what files, what home directories they land in. And all of that is fully captured in the audit logs. So for customers that are dealing with regulatory compliance issues, they have the ability to see everything that was accessed, when it was accessed, etc. And then finally, as you enter data into the data lakes, run analysis on it, and come up with insights, many times those insights are really valuable. And they're valuable as monetizable content that you want to share with subscribers. So you need to be able to redistribute that data. The interesting piece about AWS Transfer here is that we can use these same protocols that we use to connect data into the data lake to help subscribers also access the insights that are generated from the data and use those fine-grained access controls to selectively control entitlements for who's allowed to see what data. So let's talk about some of the customer stories and customers that use AWS Transfer. We have tens of thousands of customers across many industries, including financial services, media and entertainment, healthcare, life sciences, education, and government customers, and many more. Let's talk about specifically FINRA. FINRA is a nonprofit organization that is responsible for ensuring the integrity of the stock market. And they take in up to 135 billion market events per day across 600,000 of their member broker-dealers that they help in analyzing the data from these member brokers. So they use AWS Transfer Family to file transfer protocols to transfer files from these brokers that they monitor into Amazon S3, which they use as their data lake. And they do this while maintaining these critical connections to their existing authentication capabilities to make sure that the data that they're collecting is always secure and is always coming from the right parties. The use of transfer helped FINRA eliminate a number of storage silos that they had, which allows them to maintain one source of data truth, reduce their operational investments for infrastructure, drive down that management cost, and really just modernize all of their applications. So the net result is they're able to integrate a large volume of external data into a data lake and maintain security and control of that data while also modernizing their environments. So here we're going to hand it over to Russ and let him walk through some of the features in more detail that I've touched on, and then we'll go into a demo.
Thanks, Matt. Let's take a look at some of the transfer family features that you'll need to accept third-party data into your data lake. We'll start by looking at a recap of our recent launches. Starting in early 2021, we added EFS integration. This allows you to use EFS as a storage target for receiving or distributing data to third parties. We've managed AD integration was added next. This is AWS Directory Services. We expanded FTPS options to broaden our client support with that protocol. Our most important launch of 2021 was our low-code automation engine that we call Workflows, was launched at Storage Day. Then we went on and launched integration with S3 access points. We added dashboards for monitoring into our console. We enhanced our third-party identity solution. We gained FedRAMP compliance. And most recently, we launched in the Osaka region. We added the ability to configure a banner for your server, and we enhanced the workflows that we launched in Storage Day last year. When you're looking to include third-party data in your data lake, nothing will be more important than protocols. As Matt touched on, we have SFTP and FTPS for internet-based transfers, in addition to FTP for internal network transfers. And if you need to enable web access for your end users, we do offer an open source web client as well. In the authentication space, we have various tools for advanced access controls. We have integration with AWS Directory Services, and we have the ability to bring your own identity. So this is to integrate third-party identity solutions as well. Automation, this is really where our workflows engine shines. This is an event-driven architecture that allows you to process your data using low-code workflows. Other types of automation you may need with file transfer would include the ability to reach out to an external file transfer solution, maybe pull a file in. We call that external connectors. We have an SA-built solution there as well. And in the security and compliance realm, this is extremely important with this type of data. We have a variety of network security models, such as the ability to host your endpoint inside of a VPC and use an allow list to control access, or the ability to integrate with AWS Network Firewall or AWS WAF. In addition, we're going to be logging all your server activity out to CloudWatch for easy auditing. And sometimes with security and compliance, you may actually need to process your data for something like a malware scan. And that's, again, an area where our workflows engine would be particularly helpful. Let's dig into access controls in finer detail. We have a three-tiered approach to access management for your AWS storage through Transfer Family. We start with an IAM policy, and that's going to have a role attached to it. Each user is going to get mapped to an IAM role with a policy that sets the initial scope of storage access at a bucket or file system level. From there, we use tools unique to the storage, such as S3 access points, to define things like asymmetrical access. This is what we call it when we have a mixture of read-write and read-only data across multiple folders. You can either manage that through a really complex IAM role and policy, or with access points that becomes extremely easy to manage. In EFS, we have the ability to define a POSIX profile, and that POSIX profile allows us to extend that same asymmetrical access concept all the way down to a granular level of per file. And then Transfer Family offers a final tool of revision called logical directories. This allows you to define mappings of friendly folder names that map back to file systems, buckets, folders, prefixes inside of those file systems and buckets. It obscures the actual path to the data for security, and also it will cheroot the users where they can only see the mapped directories to further refine that namespace down to just the data they should be accessing. Once you've decided what data a user needs to see, you'll need to decide on authentication strategy for your end users. And this chart gives you some things to think about as you pick a solution for authenticating your users. Perhaps you just need SFTP and public-private key exchange is sufficient for your needs. You may just want to use our service managed users. You just manage them right in the same console as the Transfer Family service itself. Or if you need passwords, you can use something as simple as AWS Directory Services to give yourself password control across all of our protocols. If you need to go even deeper or more complex, or you have your own solution for identity management, we have our custom IDP that allows for you to do a mixture of things like keys and passwords, for example. Let's dive into our external identity providers in more detail. AWS Directory Services gives us access to integrate with managed AD as well as AD connector. We do define access at a group level. However, we are able to set up individual accesses by capturing the username as a variable. We are going to offer password authentication using AWS Directory Services across all of our protocols. AD Connector is actually a really neat tool that allows you to connect back to your on-premises AD or perhaps your self-managed AD in the cloud without having to establish a two-way trust. So Directory Services gives you a really simple path to support passwords and go ahead and maybe use the same group policies that you have on premises to drive access in the cloud through Transfer Family as well. With our Bring Your Own Identity Management System, you have the ability to integrate nearly any identity provider downstream with Transfer Family. Lambda is a critical component of this architecture. Transfer Family is going to be calling Lambda to actually complete the identity lookup. We have a variety of examples available in our blog channel, such as Okta, Secrets Manager, Cognito, but you can also integrate Transfer Family with nearly any homegrown identity solution or something as simple as a database table that you maintain in-house. And for those customers that want to integrate AWS WAF, you can optionally include an API gateway in your architecture that will then hand off the authentication piece to the Lambda function in place of Transfer Family, but it allows you to integrate WAF for greater network security. Additionally, you may need some custom solutions. You may need to do things like reach out into external file transfer solutions and pull files in that you want to include in your data lake. We have a convenient container orchestrated workflow available that you can check out and deploy in order to do that. Or you may need to allow for web access. As I mentioned before, you have this web client, open source web client. This is also available in our blog channel. For both of these architectures, you can find templates and automated tools for deploying these in your own environment. So to shift the focus to managed workflows, when you're going to include third-party data in your data lake, you're definitely going to want to do some processing around that data. So at a high level, we saw customers who needed to process data suffering from several challenges. For one thing, there's many different layers of the solution having to come together and be operated manually across many tiers. This could make it really difficult to manage failures, for example, to know when something had failed, to be able to find that. All that tracking had to be done manually across log streams from several services. And this was a really cumbersome way for customers to pre-process their data. And it came along with the fact that, there were a lot of common things that customers were doing, like making copies of files, applying tags to files, things like that, where customers, we just encountered them writing that same code over and over again. So we decided to launch workflows to help with this automation. This workflow tool allows you to see all of your logging centrally in one place in CloudWatch. In addition, you're able to trigger fail-safe modes or alternate steps that can be executed in the event that there's a problem. You can do things like configure data validation, check document types, look for certain formats. Really, you can do almost anything you want as part of the workflows engine. And you can learn more about workflows at this link, but we're going to take a deeper dive now and look at how this works. The architecture of workflows effectively divides the transfer family service into a couple of separate tiers. We have the file transfer server itself. This provides all of our basic protocol access, storage access. This is where you'll define all of your accesses. And then we have our workflows tool, and our workflows tool is where you'll define the steps of processing that you want to do for your data. You can define these workflow steps in our console using our API or even with a CloudFormation template. You can do common operations such as copying, tagging, even deleting a file once it's already been processed using pre-built APIs so that you don't have to write that code. And then if you do need to do more advanced operations, we offer a Lambda function integration in order to allow you to. These are only going to trigger and execute when an upload has been completed, and that's going to ensure the integrity of the data that's actually getting processed. We have this exception handler engine as a part of our workflow tool, and that allows you to specify these alternate steps in the event you encounter an error while processing your file. And finally, we're going to take all the metrics and logs associated with workflows, and we're going to centralize those out into CloudWatch for easy auditing later. So let's actually take a look at a demo where we can see what is happening. I can actually show you how to use a workflow yourself as part of your data lake. We're going to take a look at the architecture first. I have a transfer family server that is attached to a managed AD domain for authentication. And that transfer family server is going to have we're going to configure a workflow for it. That workflow, we're going to log in as a user called MFT publish. We're going to upload a CSV file. This represents data that would be flowing potentially through to your data lake. And this particular CSV file actually contains columns of data that we would prefer not to include in our data lake because they're PII. So we're going to actually process this data with our workflow. Got a few steps that are going to execute as part of our workflow. First, we're going to make a copy of the workflow for archive purposes. Then we're going to apply a tag to that copy. This is going to make for easy life cycling of that archive copy later to things like Glacier or Glacier Deep Archive. We're going to call a Lambda function, a custom workflow, as a part of our workflow, and that's going to actually reach into the Athena service and execute a SQL query that redacts the columns that you don't want to include as the data flows through. It's going to, once that data has been redacted, we're actually going to go ahead and filter it, stage it out to another folder that would represent a data lake. And then we're going to go back and we're actually going to delete the original file from the originally uploaded data because we've got an archive copy if we need it. And we don't necessarily need to preserve that data and have it sitting around in an inbox somewhere. So we'll be doing that as well. We'll log in as another user that represents a subscriber that has access to that redacted data. And we'll download and compare the two files so that you can see what's happening. So I'm going to switch over to my console. Okay, now I'm in the transfer family console, and I'm going to go ahead and define our workflow. So I'm going to create the workflow here. And as part of that, I do have to go ahead and give it a name or a description. And we'll need to go ahead and add our steps. I'm going to add the first step, and that's going to be creating our archive copy. So that's a copy file operation. Need to give that a name as well. I have to choose where I want to make a copy to. And in this case, I know I want to copy this file out to this bucket. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that bucket. In addition, I can define a prefix for my copy, and I'm going to go ahead and define that prefix as archive and capture the username of the person uploading the file as part of the prefix as well. I'm going to go ahead and check this box that says overwrite existing. If you want to keep multiple versions, you would want to turn on versioning for your bucket. Say if you're going to have the same files with the same name coming in over and over again. So we'll go ahead and do next, and we'll create this step. And then we're going to add another step. And in this step, we're actually going to tag the file that we just created to make for easier life cycling later. So I'm going to go ahead and give this step a name as well. And you'll see here I have a choice of either tagging the file that was created in my previous step or going back and tagging the original source file. I'm going to go ahead and leave it set to tag the file from the previous step. I'm going to give it a key of type and a value of archive to make it easy to find these files for life cycling later. Next, and we're going to create that step. In our third step, we'll be doing some custom processing of the file. And we'll go ahead and give that step a name. Now, in this step, I will want to go back and work with the original source file because the copy that we were most recently working with was archive copy. So I'm going to check the box here for process the original source file, and I've got my Lambda function pre-created. I'm going to go ahead and bump this timeout out so that the Lambda function has time to execute and process our file. And then as our last step, I'm going to go ahead and delete the original file. It's assuming that the previous step executed correctly. We'll go ahead and delete that file that contains the data that we don't want to include in our data lake. All right, so this is where we could define exception steps, and you could throw an exception, say, in your custom code, and in the event the exception came out, you could execute some alternate steps, and that could do something like send out a notification, copy the file out to a different folder to be looked at later. Those kinds of things can be defined. We won't be doing that as part of our demo, but let's go ahead and create the workflow. And now you can see the workflow is in our list here. So we're going to go to the Transfer Family server that we've set up for today's demo. The Transfer Family server does have some accesses already defined here. You can see this is the AD group, and we've defined mappings for what bucket. And you see we're using the username as part of that as well. Also in this particular Transfer Family server, I did, under additional details here, define a message of the day. You can see it's welcome to the Transfer Family 2022 Tech Talk demo. This is our recently launched login banner that you can define on your server. So let's go ahead and attach the workflow we made in the previous step, and let's save that. So now our Transfer Family server is up and running. It's using AD for authentication, and it's going to process the files according to the workflow that we just created. Let's go ahead and log in as a publish user. You see here our message of the day is received. And then in this particular case, I need to password authenticate. And as you can see, there's nothing in my Transfer Family home directory for this particular user, but I do have my CSV file. Here's an example of my CSV file. You see, this represents some data that includes social security numbers and street addresses. These are PII columns. This is what we're actually going to redact from the file as we upload it. But for now, I just wanted to show you what it looked like before. And I'm going to go ahead and upload this through our Transfer Family server. So Transfer Family is accepting the file. It's putting it in S3 on behalf of this user. and then it's going to execute our workflow against it. As part of executing our workflow, we can now go into our bucket, and we should be able to go ahead and refresh our view and see that we now have an archive folder that was created by our workflow in the previous step. Let's see here. And we see inside the archive folder, we do have a folder based on our username. And here is our archive copy of the file that we just uploaded. So that means that our workflow has processed, created our archive copy, and that should mean that we can pick up our file through our subscribers folder. So let's go ahead and log in as the subscriber. Again, we'll see our login banner displayed as we log in. And we'll see here that our upload data CSV file is here. We're going to go ahead and pull that down to a local folder. And now in our local folder, we'll have this copy of this file. And let's go ahead and take a look and see what it looks like. Here is our new copy, and you can see that our workflow not only appended some useful information here, what the columns actually represent, it got rid of our social security numbers, our street addresses. So essentially, this is data that we did not want to flow through to our data lake, and we've used workflows to redact it and ensure that we don't have this PII in our data lake. And so also want to look at one more thing, which is if we go back to our publish user and refresh our view, you'll see that the file disappeared. That's because the last step that we did in our workflow is we deleted the original source file because we have that second copy out in S3 for archive. So let's go back and finish our presentation. So you can do all kinds of advanced things with workflows once you have this concept. And really, when you're working with third-party data and you're loading that data into your data lake, you're going to want to do some more advanced things with workflows. Some of the things you may want to do would include a malware scan, or perhaps you're receiving the data in an encrypted format in PGP, and you need to decrypt it before you load it into your data lake. These are examples of things you could do with workflows. And of course, with the exception handler, you have the ability to define these alternate steps. And that's really critical when you're doing something like a malware scan. You need to be able to define what to do in the event the malware scan is positive. Or if you failed to decrypt your PGP encrypted file, you'd need to go take a look at that and figure out perhaps what was wrong with your key. So let's tie all this together. When we want to bring this concept all back into the data lake, this is an example of an architecture where transfer family is being used to receive third-party data from a healthcare provider or various providers, and that data is then going through multiple transfer family custom workflows. The first one actually goes and sets permissions on the file so that the appropriate groups can get access to them in EFS. And then the second custom Lambda function that is processing this file is actually going to load that data out to Kinesis. And from Kinesis, it's going to get picked up by Glue ETL. It's going to get transformed and loaded into the lake in S3, where our data engineers have configured our jobs, inferred our schema, and more importantly, where our data scientists are then able to query that information from the data lake and set up the analysis that they need. This is an example from a real world use case. And if you want to try something like this yourself, you can follow this URL which will take you to a workshop that will allow you to deploy this code yourself. So thanks very much for attending our session today. If you want to learn more about Transfer Family, including finding these blog samples, you can always go to our website, find our demos, our blogs, use cases, and more.